Hello everyone, I'll make a start and I'm sure people will join us along the way. As was yesterday, we ended up with quite a big crowd at the end. So I'll get started on what I wanted to talk about today, which is building a flood wall and the things you must consider. From my experience, it seems quite a popular activity at the minute to just think, I'll throw up a wall and that will stop me from flooding. But there are a few fundamentals to cover, and so good to talk about them, spread the information, and then hopefully people can be more informed and make better choices to reduce the flood risks to their homes and businesses. So who am I? I am Simon Crowther. I'm a civil engineer, fellow of C.WEM, and chartered water and environment manager. I was also flooded in 2007, prior to any property flood resilience measures, and so have been really passionate about helping reduce flood risk for other people. And I'm often known as the flood guy, and the reason behind that is I was doing a few interviews in York, actually, which you can see in the top photo here with Kay Burley following some flooding, and the producers kept referring to me as the flood guy. Could never remember my name, and I thought, well, if that's what they're going to know me as, I may as well champion it. So trademarked it, and I literally became the flood guy. And so this is inside my family home in 2007, flooded 5 times that summer. But we weren't near a river or the sea. It was before surface water mapping existed. And so we weren't aware of the risk, which many people in the UK sadly aren't, especially with surface water being the biggest risk factor when it comes to flooding. And this was the inside during the strip out. So we were out of the house for nearly a year. There was a 6-figure insurance claim whilst the property was reinstated. And we took measures to defend that property, and it actually hasn't flooded since. And I went on to set up my company in flood risk consulting in 2012. We've since grown to a team of people. We are an environmental agency partner and undertake their flood risk assessments across the northeast and northwest. But following on from the success of a chap called Nick Lupton, who built a flood wall around his home in Worcestershire, building a flood wall seems to be quite a hot topic. But there can be some misconceptions when building a wall. Things I've heard without any designs being created. Customers said, my builder says this is as strong as an ox. That's quite a common one. Or, for instance, in this picture here, saying, well, the wall held up last time it flooded. It's like, I'm not surprised because you had water on both sides of the wall. There was no pressure. The minute you try and use it as a defense, you're creating pressure on one side. Another one was when it came to designs, I don't want any of this. I want people here with shovels digging trenches. And that comes down to, again, a sort of totally understandable point of view, which is people are worried about flooding and they want action. They want to mitigate their risk, and a wall is a really visual thing. What's less visual is the drainage that's underneath it, that if you don't consider, you've not created a flood defense, you've created a moat because it fills up on the inside. So too often, I see people jump straight to building a flood wall without considering where the drains flow or whether the wall will stand pressure of flood waters. And in worst cases, this can result in ineffective walls that can create more problems than they solve, either by allowing water to pull behind them, or collapsing under pressure. And I haven't put the photo in here, but I have a photo of a wall from this same village that actually collapsed during the flood. The chap had spent £30,000 building this flood wall, and under the load it gave way. And you've got to imagine suddenly what changed from fairly slow rising floodwater became a catastrophic gush of water that sadly took with it his Aston Martin. And so the importance of getting this right early is key. And if you don't, you can create a lot more problems, which is why I wanted to talk about it. But this is the property that seem to stem a lot of the wall building press. And this is a guide that a lot of you will know Mary Dono, OBE, put together with Nick, who designed and built the wall. But fundamentally, it needs to start with a flood risk assessment and survey. So actually, is the wall the right outcome, starting from the beginning? We need to be looking at things like the flood levels, what might climate change be as an impact, water ingress routes, so using things like source, pathway, receptor model, understanding the depth, the duration, the frequency, the ground conditions, because they'll impact on what foundations you might need, but also the soil type for what flow you might have under a wall. Considering things like the drainage routes, because fundamentally you need to know where drainage flows. The last thing you want is to build a flood wall and then it fill up on the inside through the drainage routes. And also considering where the water will flow. The key thing we find when actually getting consents for flood walls, displacement of water can generally be worked around. You can create compensatory storage or look at the impact on the floodplain, but what you can't do is interfere with the flow of water. So if water was flowing across your land to get back to a river, trying to build a wall there could be quite catastrophic. So following on from that is a stage where you look at options development and also consider things like the floodplain impact calculations. So you want to assess where the wall will go and try and have it actually as close to the property so that you can ensure minimal water displacement and avoid impacting neighbouring properties. You want to understand the topography of the land, so having a topographical survey, and avoid creating a bowl, and maintaining access points as well. This isn't just in a sort of more generic house about access to the doorway, access to the driveway. If you're near a river, you need to think about the buffer strips as well, where the Environment Agency actually need access to the riverbank. So you can't just go and build a wall on the riverbank, as appealing as that may seem. Also making sure the wall's not outflanked. I see this quite often where people will put a wall across the driveway and then don't consider that actually it's still going to come in through the neighbours and round. So thinking about actually the point at which the wall needs to join up to the high point. And then looking at backflow and drainage, making sure water's not flowing in through the drains, and the floodplain impact. So this is looking at what water you might displace across the floodplain, considering things where the compensatory storage might be needed. And if there's a reasonable amount of land, this can be done quite easily with a bit of land regrading. But like I said, you want to avoid impacting a flow path fundamentally. And then considering things like the hydraulic gradient, so that's the soil type, how quickly is water going to try and find its natural level and level out on both sides of the wall. And then considering things like what services go under the wall as well. So are there conduits for pipes that act as flow paths? Fundamentally, it's all about understanding what's already there before we do anything else. So you want to treat a flood wall not as an isolated structure, but as part of a broader flood resilience strategy, thinking about things like the drainage, the groundwater, downstream impact, long-term maintenance, climate change allowances, and the regulatory framework in which you're operating in. Then you want to consider the structural design plan and also the buildability. And I think this is quite a key area, and it's not a criticism of anyone, but what can happen is if you send off a design to a structural engineer, if they've never actually been to the site, it's hard for them to conceptualize, well, can I get that size of digger around the side of the house? Can I, is this actually achievable on site? So with the structural design also comes the buildability concept. So the wall needs to be strong enough to resist both overturning and sliding. And as I mentioned, I've seen walls pushed over because they weren't designed and built correctly to withstand the flooding. And like I was saying, if the wall was to suddenly collapse, the mechanism of failure is much, much more significant than if the water had just risen in its natural state. And that wall failure could cause a significant wave, which results in further collapse, injury, or even death. We also want to think about access issues as well. And I've got on the screen a couple of designs that I was involved in. And actually the reason that this design has sort of circular areas to actually avoid having a manhole that served multiple properties from actually within the defended area, because that would have been a particular weak point where water from the surrounding area could have flowed into the site, and then trying to bring the wall as close to the property as possible, and actually looking at structural design with suitable rebar foundation, and also designing it to the depths predicted on site. Then you've got to consider things as well, like the higher the wall, the much more significant the cost is going to be, because the amount of structural design it's going to need. The foundation becomes significantly bigger because the loads do. But fundamentally, there's still going to be consents that are required. So it's best practice to look at having the wall near the house, near the building, to try and reduce the impact. But there are different areas and different consents that you might need. And so simplifying the complexity here, I'm going to deal with 3 issues, and I'm going to swap to my notes as well, because fundamentally it's quite complex, which is why it's good to get the right advice. So firstly, it's about dealing with flooding from ordinary watercourses. So these are smaller watercourses or surface water, and perhaps where planning permission for a local wall or landscaping is not needed. Then secondly, I'll look at where flooding stems from a main river, but planning permission might not be required in that instance. And then thirdly, where planning permission is required. And you can check on the Environment Agency for England main river map. So the area where I was from originally is this village called Woodborough. And you can see in areas that the river is a main river, but complexity arises as well where you've got tributaries. So this drainage ditch here, which also floods, is classed as an ordinary watercourse. So actually understanding the fundamentals of what's causing the flooding and what permits you might need. So once you've assessed drainage and confirmed that a wall might be viable, the first question is going to be what type of watercourse are you dealing with? So as I mentioned, you can check, is it main river or surface water? And the next step is about whether you would need planning permission. So in many cases you don't, but you would if a wall was over 1 metre high next to a highway, or over 2 metres high elsewhere, or you're in the grounds of a listed building, or in a conservation area with an Article 4 direction. So when in doubt, it's best to check with the local planning authority early. So the scenario 1, an ordinary watercourse. This is where planning permission isn't required, and it doesn't fall under Environment Agency permitting requirements either. So it actually falls under the Land Drainage Act, which means technically you need land drainage consent and compliance with local bylaws. There's a bit of a nuance to this, because as a riparian owner, you're allowed to protect your property, but only if the works don't increase flood risk for other people. And authorities tend to be supportive here if you can actually demonstrate there's not a negative impact. But like I mentioned earlier, the biggest thing is if you were to block a natural flow path. So if water used to cross your land on its way back to a watercourse, a wall could trap it or divert it to a neighbour, and that's a much bigger concern than pure water displacement, which can often be managed with compensatory storage. Now, the grey area here is, in some areas, when discussing this, the lead local flood authority has given detailed feedback, they've asked for revisions, and then they've said, fundamentally, we're really happy with this, we support it. And in other areas, they've said they won't object, but they can't give a clear sign-off because they say the neighbour could still raise a dispute, and it's on your head to prove there's no harm. So in some areas, the lead local flood authority might champion it, and in others, they might just say, we don't object. But to make sure you don't have any civil claim later, it's obviously fundamental that you do those floodplain calculations. The next one tends to be more similar across the country because there's standard permits for it. So this is main river flooding, but again, assuming you're in an area where you don't need planning permission. But building a wall would likely trigger the need for an environmental permit or a flood risk activity permit. So you need a permit if the activity could increase flood risk, affect land drainage, or it involves building near a main river. And this is what we used to call flood defence consents many years ago. But there are 3 possible routes here. Firstly, you've got an exemption, which is simple works meeting strict conditions. And actually, things like fitting flood barriers to your house on the actual house are under an exemption clause. You've then got standard rules permits, which are fixed rules for common activities, and then everything else falls under a bespoke permit. Now, for building flood walls, there is one exemption as well, FRA 26 it's called, which allows small raised defences around up to 6 adjoining properties if all of the following conditions are met, which are that the wall's not within 8 metres of a main river, it's a maximum of 1 metre high and 6 metres wide, it's within your own boundary, it protects existing buildings, and it's no closer than 20 metres to any building you don't own. So for most houses in a built-up area, that wouldn't actually apply. So if you can't meet those, you then into bespoke permit territory. And for that, you'll need to demonstrate no increased risk, which is often by compensatory storage. And actually, if you're doing it near a river, you might need to consider things like ecology too, plus how you would undertake the works and when. The third scenario is when planning permission might be required. So for instance, you're in the grounds of a listed building or conservation area. And for that, you'd need to produce a flood risk assessment as part of the planning application, showing that the wall's the right route to take, it's the right height for the risk, the construction's going to be suitable, demonstrate you're not increasing risk elsewhere, how impacts are being mitigated, and potentially in some areas, it might need flood modelling depending on the complexity. You might also need to consider the environmental impact, the effect on wildlife and habitat, and the need for an emergency plan. So with this, you've got to identify the watercourse, check the planning rules, make sure your design doesn't make the risk worse for other people. And then if you actually get those fundamentals right, the permitting process can be quite manageable. Then we get to the exciting bit following on from that, which is the construction phase. So as I mentioned earlier, you've got to make sure it's buildable and think about actually trying to make it look nice and in keeping as part of the design. So this is a particularly nice one I liked at the bottom where the middle of it's actually concrete. So the bricks are just there to blend it in. And they were a good brick choice for the property with a flood barrier in the middle. This was another property that did follow all the right consenting rules. There used to be a hedge there. So unfortunately, there was a slight loss of natural habitat, but the house kept flooding through a front wall of the property. And so this wall was proposed to actually try and give a bit of space between the wall and the floodwater, the house and the floodwater, but the displacement of water was really limited, so it was given the green light. You've also got to think about integration with other measures, so things like pumps, and actually this picture here is a sump pump that's embedded in the patio, and when flooding is likely and there's a flood warning, the residents swap the lid on it for one that's got holes in, but it just makes their life a lot easier because being flooded is incredibly stressful, but actually not being flooded is still really stressful because you're having to kind of monitor, oh, there's an ingress route over here I hadn't considered, or thinking about how can I support the neighbours, how can I do this? It's a stressful time. So the more you can do to make it less stressful is better. So actually that's a really nice option they've got there because to the untrained eye, you almost can't see it. But during a flood, there's an automatic float in that sump pump, just a bit like the stopcock in your toilet, rises and drops and the pump turns off and on and off and on as needed. And it's one less thing for them to need to do. Then you've got things like a non-return valve here. This is a full port non-return valve with an access chamber. And then this bottom one is another example of one of those sump pumps. So inside a pump, you can have inlets into it. And actually the photo I just showed you on this slide, so bottom left picture, you just remember that one there. With the bottom left picture here, that's the same property where there was a design for a flood wall quite near to the house, but around the patio, and then a huge garden beyond that. And the drainage system was designed with a non-return valve on the surface water, but when that couldn't flow anymore, it would divert into a pump chamber and discharge the water to the other side of the flood wall. So even in the flood scenario, it will be trying to keep the water inside the wall to a lower level. And then factoring into all of this is maintenance, which is key as well. So the house I mentioned earlier on That was my family home in 2007. We don't own the house anymore, but this was it in 2023. So they've got a flood wall at the front with barrier across the driveway, and the house actually hasn't flooded since, so the measures have been really, really effective. I think also key in this is to think about when not to build a wall. It's not the answer in every scenario. It's certainly something we've been finding is people expecting walls to be cheap. And I think obviously the price of building has continued to increase of late, and wall construction is costly, but so are the designs to get it right. So fundamentally, looking at things like budget constraints, the engineering fundamentals, foundations, permits can often exceed the expectations, where people might think they could build a wall for $5,000 and actually to do it properly it might be 25. Also considering the property type. So if you're a terraced house and you created a flood wall, you're still going to have water coming likely through the internal walls. Displacement as well, where you really can't do anything to reduce the impact on other properties. Or perhaps, as we mentioned, proximity to a river. And distances may trigger permits or make construction impractical. Proximity to other properties, drainage constraints, equally the depth. If we reach some point, it's just unlikely to be safe to do so, and you'd be better looking at flood recoverability. So how do we reduce the impact, but fundamentally keeping the pressure in equilibrium. Looking at the ground conditions as well. If the soil's really poor, you might get a lot of flow through it. Access limitations as well. This can be challenging if you're potentially trying to do something around a patio and there's not access for the right machinery, particularly in a flood wall where you might need concrete, rebar, and lots of heavy blocks. Also thinking about the maintenance responsibility and planning and permitting. But the fundamental one here, I think, is or where there's a better option. And that can be things like considering SUD schemes, surface water drainage. So there was recently a warehouse I was working on from a sort of initial concept through to some final designs. And it was initially a sort of conversation around, let's build a wall around the whole site. This was what they wanted to do and defend the property. But there was a nice piece of amenity land with it that wasn't built on, wasn't used. Somebody just came and mowed the lawn every week, and that was all it was really there for. And because it was surface water, we started to think about actually whether we could utilize that piece of land to keep it as an amenity, but to manage the surface water better. And came up with some designs to utilize things like a drainage basin. And actually that was likely to reduce the risk far better than the wall, because they're not trying to hold the water out. They're thinking about where we can use it on site. And from a commercial property that had flooded, I think 3 times in the last 5 years and couldn't get flood insurance, through to having model designs that showed how the water could be managed on site, that actually enabled them to go ahead and sell the property to someone who wanted to take on that work and take on the building. So that was actually a much better alternative. But it comes back to when building a wall, we need to think about the data, what's already there, the design, the permits, and how we're going to build and how we're going to maintain it. So it's just applying effectively a fairly standard engineering ethos that you would use throughout any engineering project if you're doing it well to a flood wall. But I think what's key with what I've said here is as well, not to start the project thinking, I want a flood wall, but to start and think, how can I better manage the flood risk? And it may be that a flood wall is a proposal, but let's consider everything first. And that's what comes in with that first flood risk assessment and data stage. And yesterday I spoke about the Syria C.790 Code of Practice, and the first 3 stages there are risk assessment, survey, options development, and design. So you wouldn't really be thinking about the wall until middle of stage 3, where that's where you're coming up with the designs for that. So they're my thoughts on building a flood wall. Really happy to take questions. Also, feel free to connect with me if you haven't already, and there's a QR code to visit our website. But thank you for listening, and also we have filmed this, so it will be available to recap with online and shared wider than Floodex as well. So thank you for that, and happy to take any questions.